pregnant woman doesn't collapse in the middle of nowhere without a story carved in blood and desperation. When Samuel Hayes found her crumpled against the base of that old pine, her dress torn and mud-stained, her belly swollen with child, he knew she carried more than just life inside her. She carried secrets that could get them both killed. But let's go back to where it all started. The Montana Territory in 1873 was a place where the wind never stopped talking, whispering stories of gold and grief across endless miles of prairie grass. Samuel Hayes had come here 3 years ago with nothing but calloused hands and a need to disappear from the world that had buried his wife and infant son back in Ohio. He'd built his cabin in the shadow of the Rockies, far enough from Beartown that the local gossip couldn't reach him, close enough that he could still trade his furs and jerky for coffee and ammunition when winter demanded it. Samuel was a man built for solitude, tall and lean like a lodgepole pine, with dark hair that had started showing silver at 32 and eyes the color of winter sky. His hands were steady from years of trapping, his voice soft from months of talking only to his horse and the wind. The townspeople called him the Silent Mountain Man, though never to his face. They respected him for his skill with a rifle and his fair dealings, but they didn't understand a man who chose emptiness over company. He preferred it that way. This particular morning, Samuel had been checking his trap lines along Willow Creek when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Not the cry of a wounded animal or the call of a hawk, but something far worse. The broken sob of human despair echoing through the pine trees like a prayer with no answer. Samuel froze, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his shoulder. In 3 years of living alone in these mountains, he'd learned to trust his instincts above all else. And his instincts were screaming that whatever lay ahead would change everything. He followed the sound deeper into the woods, moving with the quiet grace of a man who'd spent years learning how to walk without disturbing the world around him. The crying grew stronger, more desperate, until he rounded a bend in the deer trail and saw her. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins and now hung in tangled waves around a face pale as birch bark. Her dress, once blue calico, was now the color of earth and desperation. But it was her belly that made Samuel's chest tighten with recognition and pain. She was far along, maybe 7 or 8 months, and she held that swollen curve with protective arms even as she wept. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Her lips were cracked from thirst. And when she looked up at him through tears that had carved clean tracks down her dirty cheeks, Samuel saw something in her eyes that he recognized too well. The look of someone who had lost everything and was still falling. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "Please, I can't go any further." Samuel had spent 3 years avoiding moments like this, moments when another person's pain demanded something from him that he wasn't sure he had left to give. He'd come to these mountains to escape the weight of caring, to live in a world where the only suffering he had to witness was his own. But as he looked down at this broken young woman, her hand pressed protectively over her unborn child, Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd thought was safely buried alongside his family back in Ohio. "You're safe now," he heard himself saying, though he knew that might be the biggest lie he'd ever told. In the Montana Territory, safety was as rare as rain in August, and a pregnant woman alone in the wilderness was about as safe as a lamb in a wolf den. She tried to stand when he approached, but her legs gave out, and Samuel caught her before she could fall. She weighed almost nothing, and when he lifted her into his arms, he could feel every rib beneath her torn dress. This woman hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, maybe weeks. "My baby," she gasped against his shoulder. "Something's wrong with my baby." Samuel's jaw clenched. He'd delivered calves and foals, had even helped birth a few human babies back when he lived in town, but pregnancy complicated by starvation was something else entirely. Something dangerous. "What's your name?" he asked quietly as he carried her toward his cabin. "Mary," she whispered. "Mary Whitmore." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Whitmore. He'd heard that name whispered in the saloons of Beartown, always followed by words like outlaw and wanted and dead or alive. The Whitmore gang had been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories for the better part of 2 years, robbing banks and stagecoaches, leaving bodies in their wake. Samuel's step slowed as the implications crashed over him. If this woman was connected to the Whitmore gang, if she was wife or sister or lover to one of those wanted men, then helping her wouldn't just be an act of Christian charity. It would be treason in the eyes of the law and suicide in the eyes of every bounty hunter and lawman within 100 miles. But as Mary Whitmore's head lolled against his shoulder and he felt the weak flutter of her breath against his neck, Samuel made the decision that would define everything that came after. He kept walking toward his cabin, carrying his dangerous burden through the pine-scented morning air, while somewhere in the distance, the mountains seemed to hold their breath and wait to see what kind of man he truly was. Samuel's cabin sat in a small clearing where he'd felled the trees himself, each log cut and fitted with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. It wasn't much, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a bed he'd built from pine planks, but it was warm and dry and hidden from the world by walls of evergreen. He laid Mary on his own bed, pulling the woolen blankets up to her chin. She was shivering despite the June warmth, her skin hot with fever. When he pressed his palm to her forehead, she was burning up. "Water," she whispered through cracked lips. Samuel brought her a tin cup filled from his well, supporting her head as she drank in desperate gulps. Some of the water spilled down her chin, and she began to cry again. Quiet tears that spoke of shame and exhaustion. "Easy now," Samuel said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Small sips. Your stomach needs time." As she drank, he studied her face in the dim light filtering through his single window. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she was beautiful in the way that frontier women often were. Carved lean by hardship but still carrying traces of the girl she'd been before life had worn her down. There was intelligence in her green eyes, and something else that made Samuel's chest tighten. Hope, fragile as spun glass, but still there. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked. Mary's hand moved protectively over her belly. 3 days, maybe 4. I lost track. Samuel turned to his stores, beans and salt pork, cornmeal and coffee, and began preparing a thin broth that wouldn't shock her empty stomach. As he worked, he felt her watching him with the wariness of a wild animal that couldn't decide whether to trust or flee. "You know who I am," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Samuel didn't turn around. "I know the name Whitmore." "Then you know I shouldn't be here. You know what helping me could cost you." He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town just last week, when he'd gone to trade pelts for supplies. Sheriff Morrison had been showing wanted posters to every man in Beartown, his weathered face grim with purpose. "Whitmore gang hit another bank," Morrison had said, stabbing the poster with his finger. "Killed 2 guards in broad daylight. There's a $1,000 bounty on each of them, dead or alive. You see any strangers up in those mountains, Hayes, you send word immediately." Samuel had nodded and taken his supplies and ridden home without saying a word about the woman he'd found. But now, as he stirred the broth and listened to Mary's labored breathing behind him, he wondered if his silence made him a fool or a criminal, or maybe both. "My husband," Mary said suddenly, her voice barely audible. "James. He's dead." Samuel's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. "I'm sorry. Don't be." The bitterness in her voice cut through the cabin's warmth like winter wind. "He was a hard man who made hard choices. Got himself shot robbing a stagecoach near Helena. Left me with nothing but his name and enemies I never asked for." She shifted on the bed, one hand pressed against her back. "The baby's not his." Samuel turned to look at her then, seeing the defiance in her eyes even through the exhaustion. She was waiting for his judgment, preparing herself for the condemnation that unmarried pregnant women faced in 1873, especially unmarried pregnant widows of known outlaws. "That's none of my business," Samuel said quietly. Something in Mary's face softened. "The father was a good man, a schoolteacher in Virginia City who thought he could save me from James's world. Got himself killed for the trouble." Samuel brought her the broth, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed as she cradled the warm cup in shaking hands. The cabin felt smaller with another person in it, but not in an unwelcome way. It had been so long since he'd heard another human voice that wasn't asking him to buy something or fix something or kill something. "Where were you headed?" he asked. Anywhere that wasn't here. Maybe California. Maybe Oregon. Somewhere James's enemies couldn't find me. She took a sip of broth and closed her eyes gratefully. I had some money hidden away, enough for a stagecoach ticket and a new start. But the sheriff in Helena froze my accounts when James died. Said it was all stolen money. Was it? Mary looked at him with eyes that held too much truth. Probably. James never told me where he got the money he gave me, and I never asked. I was too grateful to have food and a roof to ask hard questions. She drank more broth, her hands steadying as warmth spread through her body. I've been walking for 6 days, sleeping in barns and eating what I could find. Yesterday I thought I felt the baby move wrong, like something was wrong inside. Samuel's throat tightened. He'd seen enough difficult births on farms to know that starvation and stress could turn pregnancy into a death sentence for both mother and child. "You need a doctor," he said. Mary laughed, but there was no humor in it. A doctor who'd treat the pregnant widow of James Whitmore? For free? In the Montana Territory. She shook her head. "I'd be more likely to find a unicorn." Samuel stood and walked to his window, looking out at the pine forest that had been his sanctuary for 3 years. Somewhere beyond those trees lay Beartown, with its sheriff and wanted posters and good Christian folk who believed that helping an outlaw's widow was the same as robbing banks yourself. But when he turned back to Mary, saw her holding her belly with both hands and biting her lip against some private pain, Samuel felt something shift inside his chest. The same something that had cracked open when he first found her in the woods. "You'll stay here," he said, "until the baby comes. Until you're strong enough to travel." Mary stared at him. "You don't understand what you're risking. If they find me here, then we'll make sure they don't find you." "Samuel." She said his name like a prayer and a warning both. "These aren't just angry shopkeepers we're talking about. James had enemies who shoot first and ask questions never. And the law. Sheriff Morrison would hang you just for giving me water." Samuel walked back to the bed and knelt beside it, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and son to scarlet fever. Couldn't save them, couldn't even say goodbye properly. I came here to these mountains because I thought I was done trying to save people." He reached out and covered her hands with his own, feeling the warmth of life moving beneath her skin. "But I can't watch you and your baby die when I have the power to help. I won't." Mary's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the broken sobs he'd heard in the forest. These carried something that looked almost like hope. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's single window and carrying with it the distant sound of hoofbeats on the mountain trail. Riders moving fast with purpose. Samuel and Mary both froze, listening to the approaching thunder of horses and men, while the decision Samuel had made began to show its true cost. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until Samuel could count them. For horses, maybe 5, their riders pushing hard up the mountain trail that led past his cabin. In 3 years of living alone, he'd maybe seen a dozen riders pass this way, and never at a gallop. "Hide," Samuel whispered, but Mary was already struggling to sit up. "No," she said, her face pale but determined. "If they're looking for me, hiding will only make it worse for you. Help me to the chair by the fire. If they come in, I'm just a pregnant woman you found sick in the woods." Samuel wanted to argue, but the sound of horses was almost at his clearing now. He helped Mary to the wooden chair, smoothing her tangled hair and pulling a clean blanket around her shoulders. In the dim firelight, she looked fragile but not guilty. Just a woman far from home and heavy with a child. The horses stopped outside. Samuel counted the sound of boots hitting the ground, for men at least. Through his single window, he could see the silhouettes of riders in the late afternoon light, their shapes distorted by the glass but unmistakably armed. A fist pounded on his door with the authority of men who expected to be obeyed. "Hayes! Samuel Hayes! Open up!" Samuel recognized the voice. Sheriff Morrison, whose weathered face had haunted the wanted posters in town. He looked at Mary one more time, seeing her nod almost imperceptibly, then walked to the door and lifted the wooden bar. Sheriff Morrison stood on his threshold like judgment itself, tall and gray-bearded, with eyes that had seen too much of mankind's worst nature. Behind him stood 3 deputies Samuel didn't recognize, young men with hungry faces and hands that rested too casually on their gun handles. "Sheriff," Samuel said quietly, "what brings you up the mountain?" Morrison's gaze swept past Samuel to the cabin's interior, taking in Mary by the fire, her swollen belly, her exhausted condition. His expression didn't change, but Samuel saw something flicker behind his eyes. Surprise? Maybe, or calculation. "We're tracking the Whitmore woman," Morrison said. "Got word she was seen heading into these mountains 3 days ago. You seen any strangers up here, Hayes?" Samuel felt Mary's eyes on his back, could almost hear her heart beating from across the room. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to step aside and let Morrison take her. $1,000 bounty could buy a lot of supplies, maybe even passage back to Ohio where he could try to forget the mountains and their ghosts. Instead, Samuel found himself blocking the doorway with his body. "Just this young lady," he said, gesturing toward Mary. "Found her collapsed on the deer trail this morning. She's been sick, fever, and exhaustion. Barely conscious." Morrison studied Samuel's face with the intensity of a man whose life depended on reading truth from lies. "That's so? What's your name, miss?" Mary lifted her head, and when she spoke, her voice carried the soft accent of the Deep South. Nothing like the sharp mountain dialect Samuel had heard from her earlier. "Margaret Stevenson," she said, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "I was traveling to Montana City to meet my husband, but the stagecoach broke down near Helena. I've been walking for days." One of the younger deputies snorted. "Walking? In your condition?" Mary's eyes flashed with indignation. "That look completely genuine. My husband is a mining engineer, deputy. We've been separated for 4 months while he established our new home. I wasn't about to let a broken axle keep me from him any longer." Morrison stepped closer to her, his boots loud on the cabin's wooden floor. "Margaret Stevenson, you said? Where's your husband working?" "The Copper Crown Mine, about 10 miles north of Montana City. His name is William Stevenson, and he's expecting me within the week." Samuel watched Morrison's face, saw the sheriff weighing her words against whatever information he carried. The Copper Crown was real. Samuel had heard miners talking about it in Beartown saloons. But whether there was actually a William Stevenson working there was anybody's guess. "You got any papers?" Morrison asked. "Letters from this husband? Anything to prove who you are?" Mary's face crumpled, and fresh tears began to flow. "I lost everything when the stagecoach overturned. My trunk, my letters, even my wedding ring." She held up her left hand, showing a pale band of skin where a ring might have been. "All I have left is what I'm wearing and the baby in my belly." It was a masterful performance, Samuel thought. Desperate enough to be believable, detailed enough to be convincing, emotional enough to make grown men uncomfortable. Even Morrison seemed to soften slightly at the sight of her tears. But the youngest deputy, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, wasn't buying it. "Sheriff," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "Look at her hair. Red hair, just like the description we got from Helena. And she's the right age, right condition." Morrison's eyes sharpened, focusing on Mary's auburn hair with new interest. "That's true. Witness said Mary Whitmore had hair like autumn leaves and was far along with child." Samuel felt his blood turn to ice water. If Morrison decided Mary was lying, there would be no talking their way out of this. The sheriff was a fair man but a hard one, and he'd hanged lesser criminals for lesser crimes. "Sheriff," Samuel said quietly, "with respect, half the women in Montana have red hair and babies on the way, and Mary Whitmore's been married to an outlaw for 2 years. You think she'd be walking around the countryside alone and defenseless? Wouldn't she have guns, stolen money, some way to protect herself?" Morrison nodded slowly. "That's a fair point, Hayes. James Whitmore never traveled without an arsenal, and his woman would have learned to use it." He walked closer to Mary, studying her face in the firelight. "You know how to shoot, Mrs. Stevenson?" Mary looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Guns terrify me, Sheriff. My father wouldn't even allow them in the house when I was growing up. Said they were tools of the devil. Samuel had to admire her nerve. She was painting herself as exactly the opposite of what an outlaw's wife would be. Scared, helpless, religious. Everything Mary Whitmore supposedly wasn't. Morrison stood silent for a long moment, the cabin filled with nothing but the crackle of fire and the sound of Mary's labored breathing. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the single window. Finally, the sheriff stepped back. "We'll be moving on," he said to Samuel. "But Hayes, if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, you send word immediately. The Whitmore woman is dangerous, and she's got friends who'd kill to protect her." "Of course, Sheriff." Morrison tipped his hat to Mary. "Ma'am, I hope you find your husband safely." "Thank you," Mary whispered. "God bless you for your kindness." The lawmen filed out of the cabin, their boots heavy on the wooden steps. Samuel stayed in the doorway, watching as they mounted their horses and rode back down the mountain trail, their shapes disappearing into the gathering darkness. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Samuel close the door and turn back to Mary. She was slumped in the chair, her face white as bone, her whole body shaking with relief and exhaustion. "Margaret Stevenson?" Samuel asked quietly. Mary looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge. "My mother's maiden name, and William was my first love, back in Virginia before I met James. I always wondered what would have happened if I'd married him instead." Samuel walked to his window, staring out at the pine forest that suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like a trap. Morrison had believed them this time, but barely. And if the sheriff started asking questions in Montana City about William Stevenson, or if someone else remembered seeing Mary on the road, "They'll be back," he said. Mary nodded, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "I know. And next time, they might not be fooled by tears and a southern accent." Samuel turned from the window to find her watching him with something that looked like guilt and gratitude mixed together. "You could have turned me in," she said. "Should have turned me in. Why didn't you?" Samuel looked at this woman who had brought danger to his door and chaos to his carefully ordered life, and found he didn't have a simple answer. Maybe it was the way she held her unborn child. Maybe it was the intelligence in her eyes or the courage she'd shown facing down armed men while sick and exhausted. Or maybe it was just that he'd spent 3 years running from the world, and he was tired of running. "Because," he said finally, "a long time ago, someone helped me when they shouldn't have, and I never got the chance to pay that kindness forward." Outside, the mountain wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant sound of wolves calling to each other across the darkness. A sound that seemed to promise that the danger had only just begun. 3 days passed in a strange kind of peace. Samuel found himself settling into rhythms he'd forgotten. Cooking for two, speaking aloud during the long mountain evenings, sharing the small rituals of daily life with another person. Mary grew stronger on regular meals and rest, though she tired easily and often pressed her hand to her back with a grimace that made Samuel's chest tighten. On the 4th morning, he woke to find her standing at his window, silhouetted against the dawn light filtering through the pines. "You're up early," he said quietly. Mary didn't turn around. "I couldn't sleep. The baby's been restless all night, kicking like it's trying to escape." Samuel joined her at the window, and together they watched the sun paint the mountain peaks gold and rose. In the growing light, he could see the changes 3 days had made in her face. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes no longer held that hollow desperation he'd seen in the forest. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." He waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change things between them. "The baby's father," Mary continued, still staring out at the mountains. "His name was David Morrison." Samuel felt the world tilt sideways. Morrison, as in Sheriff Morrison's younger brother. Mary finally turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "David was teaching school in Virginia City when I met him. I was trying to leave James, had been planning it for months. David knew who I was, knew the danger of being seen with me, but he said love was worth the risk. Samuel sank into his chair, the implications crashing over him like an avalanche. Jesus, Mary. James found out about us 3 months ago, rode into Virginia City with 2 of his men and shot David in the street, in broad daylight, in front of his students. Her voice broke on the last words. Called it defending his honor as a husband. Samuel understood now why Sheriff Morrison had looked at Mary with such intensity, why his questions had carried the weight of personal investment. The lawman hadn't just been hunting an outlaw's widow, he'd been hunting the woman carrying his dead brother's child. Does Morrison know? Samuel asked. Mary shook her head. David never told him about me. Said it would put his brother in an impossible position. Family loyalty against the law. But I think Morrison suspects. There was something in his eyes when he looked at me, like he was seeing someone else. She walked to Samuel's rough wooden table, where he kept his few precious possessions. A Bible his mother had given him, a carved wooden horse his father had made, and a small tintype photograph in a silver frame. The picture showed Samuel with a dark-haired woman and a baby boy, all 3 of them smiling at something beyond the camera's range. Mary picked up the photograph with careful hands, studying the faces captured in silver and time. Your family, she said. It wasn't a question. Rebecca and Thomas. She was 24. He was 8 months old. Mary traced the edge of the frame with 1 finger. They look happy. We were. For a while. Samuel's voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of grief. Rebecca got sick first, scarlet fever that started as just a cold. Then Thomas caught it from her. I rode through a blizzard to get the doctor, but by the time we got back, he stopped, unable to finish the sentence he'd never spoken aloud. Mary set the photograph down gently and turned to face him. I'm sorry, Samuel. I can't imagine that kind of loss. That's why I came here, to these mountains. I thought if I could just be alone, if I didn't have to see children playing or hear women laughing or watch families walking to church on Sunday mornings, maybe the pain would stop feeling like a knife in my chest. Mary moved closer, her movements careful and deliberate. Did it work? Samuel looked at her. This woman who had brought chaos and danger and life back into his carefully constructed solitude, and realized that the answer was more complicated than he'd expected. For a while. But then you showed up, carrying David Morrison's child, and suddenly I'm remembering what it felt like to hope for something beyond just surviving another day. Mary reached out and touched his cheek with fingers that trembled slightly. Samuel, I need you to understand something. I'm not Rebecca. I can't replace what you lost or heal what's broken inside you. And this baby. She placed her other hand on her swollen belly. This baby isn't Thomas. I know that. Do you? Because the way you look at me sometimes, the way you touch my belly when you think I'm not paying attention, it scares me. Not because I don't care for you, but because I do. And I can't bear the thought of disappointing you when you realize I'm just Mary Whitmore, outlaw's widow, pregnant with another man's child and carrying more trouble than any one person should have to bear. Samuel stood and walked to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough to smell the soap he'd given her and the lingering scent of pine smoke from his fireplace. Mary, he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I'm not trying to replace my family. I buried them properly, grieved them completely. What I feel for you, it's not about the past. It's about right now, this moment. The woman standing in front of me who's brave enough to lie to armed lawmen and stubborn enough to walk 6 days through wilderness to protect her child. Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Even knowing what helping me could cost you? Even knowing that Sheriff Morrison might come back with more men and harder questions. Samuel thought about the risks. The bounty hunters who might follow Morrison's trail. The outlaws who might come looking for James Whitmore's widow. The simple fact that harboring a fugitive could get him hanged or shot or worse. Then he looked at Mary's face, saw the intelligence and courage and fierce maternal love that had kept her alive when everything else had failed, and knew that the calculation was simple. Especially knowing that, he said. Mary stepped closer, close enough that her swollen belly brushed against his shirt, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Samuel Hayes, she whispered. You are either the best man I've ever known or the biggest fool in the Montana Territory. Maybe both. She rose on her toes and kissed him then, soft and careful and full of promise. When they broke apart, Samuel could see something new in her eyes. Not the desperate hope of a woman with nowhere else to turn, but the steady affection of someone who had chosen to stay. The baby moved, Mary said suddenly, her hand flying to her belly. Right when you kissed me, like it approved. Samuel placed his own hand over hers, feeling the strong kick of life beneath their joined palms. For the first time in 3 years, the future felt like something more than just empty days to be endured. But even as they stood together in the morning light, sharing the miracle of new life, the mountain wind carried a sound that made Samuel's blood run cold. The distant rhythm of hoofbeats on the trail, riding hard toward his cabin. This time, there were more of them. Samuel counted 8 horses, maybe 10, their riders spread out in a wide arc that suggested military training or professional hunting experience. These weren't local deputies following up on a lead. These were bounty hunters who'd found their prey. Mary, Samuel said quietly, get to the root cellar, now. But Mary was already shaking her head, her face pale but determined. No more hiding, Samuel. No more lies. If they've come this far with this many men, they already know who I am. Through the window, Samuel could see the lead rider. A tall man in a black coat with silver hair and the kind of pale eyes that spoke of violence as a profession. Behind him rode 9 others, all armed with rifles and the casual confidence of men who killed for money. Bounty hunters, Samuel said. Worse. Mary's voice was tight with recognition. The man in front is Marcus Wade. He worked with James sometimes, but they had a falling out over money. Marcus swore he'd see James dead and collect every bounty on the Whitmore name. The riders stopped just outside Samuel's clearing, close enough that he could hear their horses snorting and stamping in the mountain air. Marcus Wade dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt revolver. Hayes! Wade's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. We know she's in there. Send out Mary Whitmore, and nobody else has to die today. Samuel looked at Mary, seeing the resignation in her eyes mixed with something fiercer, the protective fury of a mother defending her young. There's still the back window, he said. You could make it to the trees. 8 months pregnant? Against 10 mounted hunters. Mary placed both hands on her belly, feeling the strong movement of the child inside. Samuel, this baby is coming. Soon. Maybe today. I can feel it changing, getting ready. Even if I could run, I wouldn't make it a mile. Samuel's jaw clenched. In all his calculations about the risks of helping Mary, he'd never considered that she might go into labor while bounty hunters surrounded his cabin. Hayes! Wade called again. I'm going to count to 10. Then we're coming in. And we'll take her over your dead body if that's how you want it. Samuel walked to his gun rack, lifting down the Winchester rifle he'd used to hunt deer and protect his livestock. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, but he'd never pointed it at another human being. Samuel, no. Mary struggled to her feet, moving to stand beside him. I won't let you die for me. I've already cost too many good men their lives. 1. Samuel checked the rifle's action, the metallic sound loud in the cabin's silence. 2. Mary, Samuel said quietly. When I was 17, my father took me hunting for the first time, taught me that a man protects what matters to him no matter the cost. Today, you matter to me. 3. Mary's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. And you matter to me, Samuel Hayes, which is why I'm going to walk out that door and face Marcus Wade alone. 4. Like hell you are. 5. Mary moved toward the door with the determined grace of a woman who had made her mind up. I'm not letting you get hurt for me. Not again. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. Please, Samuel, let me do this. For the baby. Samuel hesitated, his hand still on the rifle. He knew Mary was right. He couldn't fight 10 men, not with a pregnant woman in the cabin. But he also couldn't let her walk out there alone. 6. Wade's voice boomed. 7. Samuel made a decision. He grabbed Mary's arm, pulling her back from the door. If you're going out there, I'm going with you. Mary's eyes widened, but before she could protest, Samuel kicked the door open. 8! Wade yelled, then stopped short, his eyes widening as he saw Samuel and Mary standing together in the doorway. 9! Samuel raised his rifle, aiming it at Wade. 10! Wade shouted. Then his men raised their rifles, aiming at Samuel. Hold it! Samuel yelled, his voice echoing through the clearing. We can talk about this. Wade smirked. There's nothing to talk about, Hayes. The bounty's on her head, and we're here to collect. What if I told you there's no bounty? Samuel said, his eyes fixed on Wade. What if I told you Mary Whitmore is dead? Wade's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Mary Whitmore died 3 months ago in Virginia City, along with her husband, James Whitmore, Samuel said. The woman standing next to me is Margaret Stevenson, a widow whose husband is a mining engineer at the Copper Crown mine. She's pregnant and lost her way. I'm just helping her. Wade's men exchanged glances. He's lying, Marcus, one of them yelled. That's Mary Whitmore. Is she? Samuel said, looking at Mary. Tell them, Mrs. Stevenson. Tell them who you are. Mary took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Wade's. My name is Margaret Stevenson. My husband, William Stevenson, is a mining engineer at the Copper Crown mine. I'm pregnant and I'm trying to get to him. Wade stared at her, then at Samuel, then back at Mary. He was clearly confused. This is a trick, Hayes, he yelled. She's Mary Whitmore. Prove it, Samuel said. You have no proof. No wanted poster, no description that matches her exactly. Just a rumor. Wade hesitated. He knew Samuel was right. He had no concrete proof that this woman was Mary Whitmore, only a vague description and a hunch. And he didn't want to risk a shootout with a man who was clearly willing to fight to protect her. All right, Hayes, Wade said finally. We'll leave. But if I find out you're lying, I'll be back. And next time I won't be alone. He turned to his men. Let's go. The bounty hunters mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Samuel and Mary standing in the doorway of the cabin, the silence of the mountains settling around them once more. Mary leaned against Samuel, her body trembling. You saved us, she whispered. Samuel wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. We saved each other. He looked out at the disappearing figures of the bounty hunters, then back at Mary. Now, about that baby. Mary smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. I think it's time. And in the quiet of the mountain cabin, surrounded by the scent of pine and wood smoke, a new life began. The end.